No historian has penetrated yet the mysteries of the Elizabethan age. It's like going through a series of doors. We've got through 3 or 4 doors, and maybe there are 3 or 4 more to come. I've learnt not to take anything for granted in the Elizabethan age, and to never assume that you have the whole truth, and also never to be shocked by any of the revelations that might come out.
It turns out that this is not just men in tights running around with lutes and flutes and a happy England. This is a dark era in the last stage of Elizabeth's reign. Suppression, censorship, imprisonment, torture. It's a place struggling with the concept of succession. From the very beginning, the question was, who are you going to marry and how are you going to deal with succession? You need a child in place. Elizabeth was very astute in knowing that she wouldn't survive very long if she named a successor or even had an ambitious husband for a consort.
In fact, in her very first address to Parliament in January 1559, Elizabeth pointed to her coronation ring and she said, "This is my wedding ring. I am married to my people, England." This myth of the Virgin Queen, which seemed to buttress her reign and protect her reputation, also, of course, eventually undermined it, because if she was the Virgin Queen, then there would be no child of her blood to succeed her. Elizabeth herself had what I would describe as a neurotic aversion to even discussing the succession. In fact, she flew into a rage when anyone mentioned it.
There is a book that came out in 1595, Conference on the Next Succession, that contains a dedication to the Earl of Essex that some have called treasonous. It is mind-boggling. And in effect, what it says is, when that time comes, you, Robert, Earl of Essex, and your followers shall settle the issue. It couldn't be more out front as identifying Essex as the key player in the succession crisis. What's not known, and is very interesting, is the rest of this book then tells an historical story to set up this notion of how Essex will settle the succession. It is Conference in the Next Succession that plays the Richard II card. It puts it on the table in 1595 as a way to look at this issue, both in the terms of the monarch who's weak and needs to be replaced, and how this can be done without fomenting total civil war. So this is what's going on when Shakespeare writes his Richard II. When John Hayward publishes his Henry IV, there is a second dedication to Essex. It is this dedication that then starts Essex's downfall, because this dedication says the same thing. You are the right hand of fortune. Fortune is the queen. You are our hero. In the middle of this dedication, it refers to our beloved Henry. Now, I think our beloved Henry in this 1599 dedication is not referring to Henry Bolingbroke as being beloved in 1599. It is referring to Henry Wriothesley. That is why this was a bombshell, that someone had let the cat out of the bag and put the full truth in print in London. And that was the beginning of the end of Essex.
In the closing years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, the power struggle over succession culminated in a famous uprising known as the Essex Rebellion. On the one side was Lord Burleigh's son, Robert Cecil, who had taken his father's place as the Queen's chief advisor. The other side was led by the young Earls of Essex and Southampton. The two popular earls had both been royal wards of Elizabeth and raised in Lord Burleigh's household, just like the Earl of Oxford. And an examination of Shakespeare's dedications reveals a close relationship between the author and one of those two aspiring kingmakers, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton.
In 1593 and 94, the name Shakespeare was printed for the first time, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. It was printed as the dedication each time to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. In other words, the author, whoever that author was, wished his name, William Shakespeare, to be connected to the Earl of Southampton.
The followers of the Earl of Essex persuaded Shakespeare's acting company to put on a special performance of Richard II for them. They wanted to create a suggestion that some of the problems of the reign of Richard II were also problems in Queen Elizabeth's time. So that was an attempt to use a Shakespeare play for political purposes.
We know that Shakespeare plays were arousing the concern of authority. On the eve of the Essex Rebellion, the players were paid an extra 40 shillings to put on a performance of Richard II, presumably with the deposition scene in it. This is the scene of his removal as king. During the Elizabethan period, the very staging or printing of that scene was considered an act of sedition against Queen Elizabeth.
The acting company, they said, we were just paid some money to put on an old play that was written many years ago and had nothing to do with the Earl of Essex. They managed to wash their hands of the affair, but it was a very dangerous brush with politics.
Box on you! Essex attempted to rally the people of London, not to overthrow the Queen, but to remove her evil counselors and save her from people like Robert Cecil. His rising, which I really don't think merits the word rebellion, it never achieved those proportions. It ended that day, never had a chance of succeeding.
This is the faction that Shakespeare is clearly identified with throughout the 1590s. So this was a catastrophic conclusion.
Essex took the hit. He was 3 strikes, you're out kind of trouble. But Southampton is spared. Southampton, in the end, paid nothing, did nothing. He simply was a co-conspirator who, after 2 years, walked and got a royal pardon. Parallel to that story is that Shakespeare's Richard II was the play involved with the rebellion. Why was Shakespeare not punished? He is the magic man. He is going through this period of turmoil untouched. And then there he is, right smack in the middle of the most famous rebellion in Elizabethan history, and he's not even called in for questioning. He just vanishes. How could that be? How could that be? Well, this is the story, as Sherlock Holmes would have it, of the dog that didn't bark. And the big brainstorm you have about the dog that didn't bark is the dog knew the burglar. The authorities in Elizabethan England knew who Shakespeare was, and they all knew what was going on.
Great Caesar! Doth not Brutus bootless kneel? Speak!
One of the reasons plays were so popular during this period was the chance to hear what playwrights thought about the charged politics of the time.
The stage is a very powerful medium of public communication. As Hamlet says, the players are the abstract and brief chronicles of the time. People came to the theater partly because they wanted to hear the latest gossip, and that's dangerous. And the playwrights dressed up the gossip in such a way that they could get away with presenting it without being caught. But every once in a while, most of them got caught.
When you realize that Hamlet is actually a character in contemporary Elizabethan politics, then you realize just how deeply upsetting these plays must have been to the government. Suddenly you realize why these works were written.
Help! 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 Oh, now a rat! Dead for! A rat is dead!
Now, there are many problems with this from an orthodox point of view. One is, if these plays are written by William Shakespeare of Stratford, how the heck did he get away with satirizing the most powerful man in England and treating him with that kind of ritualistic contempt on stage?
Is it the king?
There's no connection whatsoever between the character of Polonius and Burleigh, because the slightest sniff of the possibility that Burleigh was being satirized or even represented in a play would have led to the acting company being closed down. It was simply against the law to represent any kind of direct contemporary court or political affairs on stage.
So the fact that Shakespeare seems to be the only Elizabethan dramatist to get away without being imprisoned, branded, mutilated, may be killed when it comes to Marlowe, defies logic, unless we've got the wrong guy.
Shakespeare made a subtle change to the history of Richard II deposing, and it's an important change. Shakespeare rearranged the sequence of events so that when Bolingbroke shows up at Richard's castle, Richard is still king. When the deposition scene is played in Shakespeare's Richard II, Richard has not yet been deposed. He legally could have all these guys rounded up and killed, but he doesn't. He is talked out of the crown, talked out of it. The real history is he was already deposed, and the deposition scene in history was an ex post facto ceremony to make everyone feel good. If this is true, and Shakespeare made this change, then when Essex, Southampton, and their followers kept seeing Richard II over and over, they are looking at a how-to-do-it guidebook. How you can talk a monarch out of the crown, and skip civil war, and you have a peaceful deposition. I have come to think this is what Shakespeare was up to, and it is incredible. The historical facts surrounding the succession and the historical facts surrounding the involvement of Shakespeare, Southampton, and Essex should be looked at with a hard view to answer bona fide historical questions. And in so doing, historians would see there's something going on here. This doesn't add up. That the Stratford man could not be the author because he could not survive politically in an authoritarian state. I think historians could bring the house down.
According to the traditional histories, Shakespeare and Elizabeth reside in completely separate worlds. You know, he's this hard-nosed businessman who's got plays to churn out, whereas she, of course, is in the ivory tower world of the court, and as far as we know, they never met. But I think it's very obvious from Shakespeare's portraits of Elizabeth that he knew her intimately.
I certainly see Elizabeth all over the plays. She's everywhere. Shakespeare is always thinking of her as the key person in his audience. He's always got a message for her. She's always there.
Elizabeth's famous statement, "Know ye not that I am Richard II," proves that in her eyes at least, the dramatic representations of Richard were intended to be criticisms of her government and her actions.
8 years after the Essex Rebellion, Shakespeare's collection of 154 sonnets was printed. The fair youth, to whom many of the sonnets are addressed, has frequently been identified as the Earl of Southampton, co-leader of the rebellion. Yet no records connecting Will Shaxper of Stratford to this young earl have ever been found. Some scholars have seen this body of work as a classic example of Elizabethan doublespeak and wordplay that may unlock the mysteries of the rebellion and Shakespeare's relationships with Southampton and the Queen.
To look at the Elizabethan age and to suggest that the two great icons of that period, Shakespeare and Elizabeth, lived in entirely different realms, that there's no intersection between the age and the works, is naive.
So if Shakespeare was of the court milieu, or God forbid, a member of the royal family, then the silence surrounding him becomes natural and explicable. But of course, if the Stratford man is the author, that silence is nonsensical. Sonnet 81, "I once gone, to all the world must die," simply doesn't make sense if the Stratford man is the author. The name Shakespeare's on the title page of the sonnets, and this man, we're told, is celebrated as an actor-manager. The true author, however, knows that he is about to be obliterated.